Hey, Kate,
Hello.
we're rounding out Women's History Month 2024.
Yeah, it's been a good
And
month.
yeah, it's been a great month. It's been a fun month. And you've been actually doing a lot more reading and researching around history.
Mhm.
So I'd love for you to just give us your insights. What are you finding? And we can go from there.
Sure. So probably, I don't know, 2 months ago, I got kind of interested in the history of the US that I had no idea about. It came about because The Gilded Age on HBO
Hmm.
has a companion podcast, and I watch that show and I love it, and it's amazing. And it's like based upon families that are in New York history.
Okay.
And I went down this rabbit hole with the companion podcast that talks about the show in relation to what actually happened.
Okay.
Um, and through that, I found out that there's this like huge aspect of history that I never knew about. And I'm going to show my ignorance a little bit. I grew up on the West Coast, where, Arizona became a state like 50 years behind everybody else. Um, California, was before that, but Oregon wasn't. So those are the states that I've lived in. And just stuff is new. It's not back in the 1800s that
Right.
thing,
True.
right? So, and the things that were back there in Arizona, at least there was like, this is a field where the horses were.
Not much gilded, anything.
No guild, no guild. Here's the cowboys. So this kind of wetted my whistle, and I kind of have gone down this kind of rabbit hole of discovering different things about the 1800s, early 1900s, but mostly like 1820 to like 1920, of what was going on. And there's a couple of things that have surprised me. One, you don't hear very much about it, but there's a whole African American elite in New York, mostly based in Brooklyn. There were colleges and schools and merchants and a whole like thriving society of African Americans. But because it's Women's History Month, I thought we might talk about a little bit about the women and society in that space.
Yeah.
Um, I read a book called Strong Passions,
Okay.
which it's by, let me look at her name, Barbara Weisberg. And it is a telling of a big, salacious divorce proceeding that
Ooh.
happened in, in about 18, it was right around the time of Edith Wharton. So I think it was around 1840s. And why I bring it up is the at that point in time, the only reason you could divorce was for adultery.
Mm.
And it was considered an incredibly uh, salacious and people who got divorced were oftentimes exiled out of society. Women who got divorced were now destitute, like they had to rely on their families to uh, help fund them. That it's not like they could set up their households, and children were automatically awarded to the father.
Mm.
And so what kind of struck me in the telling of this story was just how much the institution of marriage was kind of the backbone of society to keep women in their places.
Mhm.
Another piece that really struck me was this was all during the time of the slaves were being freed, abolition was happening, suffrage was being fought for the slaves as well as for women. And in that point in time, the laws that were passed and amended to the Constitution were about Black men being able to, like, the states were punished if the Black men who were now free weren't allowed to vote. And it
Mm.
was all meant to punish the states who didn't follow those laws. But what I can't help but be, I mean, super bummed about is that women were not in that included in that suffrage, right? They weren't given equality at that time.
Mm.
Um, so that's kind of the bummer story. And in fact, this divorce proceeding happened. There was a jury of their peers of men
Ah,
who were picked to adjudicate this divorce. And basically, what they had to prove was that she was an adulterer,
hmm.
and that she wasn't forgiven by her husband. And that party countersued the the accuser, the whatever, the man, the Peter Strong in this case, and they said he was an adulterer. And in the
Okay.
case where they were both found to be adulterers, then the marriage would stay intact.
Wow.
Oh, strange, right?
That's so odd. Why would that be the outcome?
Because that way the women wasn't destitute, her
Okay.
children taken care of, taken away from her,
Okay.
and the and he didn't get to have his divorce. With this particular case, it was super funny because it ended up that the jury was hung. They didn't believe that they believed that she was an adulterer, but there were two jurors that believed that he was also an adulterer. Everybody else was like, no, he's not, whatever. So it was kind of hung. And so the they weren't allowed to get a divorce. Um, Subsequently, Peter Strong went back and negotiated with a mediator and with Mary Strong, the wife, um, to get a divorce, and they were granted that divorce. She didn't have to admit any fault, but the mediator came and said, okay, she doesn't get any alimony or anything. She just has to exist on her own, but you can have your divorce. And she was able to have one of the children.
Okay.
The funny thing is that he was allowed to remarry right away.
Hmm.
She was not allowed to remarry until he passed.
Wow.
So luckily for her, he did not live a long life. I think he died when he was like 52. And so she was able to have,
Yeah.
she ended up being I think a baroness or a countess in France or whatever. But a lot of the elite that came under scandal would go off to Europe and live their lives in there. It must have been nice to have that money where you were just a man or woman
Yeah.
of leisure.
I'll just go fly off. Yeah. Wow.
So what occurred to me just was like, oh wow, this was not just 200 years ago, that it just seemed normal that, oh yeah, we wouldn't allow women a voice in politics, or we wouldn't allow women to be on their own. It was considered disrespectful. It was only if the woman was an adulterer. And a woman could sue for if her husband was an adulterer as well, but they didn't, because that would then wreak shame on their family.
Yeah. Right.
So the second part that I'm also reading, I don't know the name of it because it's a physical book and it's out in the living room, but it's a book about the Brooklyn Bridge and the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. Um, the Brooklyn Bridge was built by the Roebling family. There was the dad and then his son, and the dad built a bunch of bridges like all over there's one in Ohio, there's one in there's a really pretty bridge in Ohio actually. There, you've probably driven over it. Uh, Pennsylvania, a bunch of different bridges,
Mhm.
right? But he also built the Brooklyn Bridge, or designed the Brooklyn Bridge. He had his son take over for him because he was feeling of ill health, and he eventually dies kind of soon into the project.
Okay.
His son was married to this woman, Elizabeth Roebling, I believe her name was, and he also fell ill. So through the engineering of the Brooklyn Bridge, they sunk caissons down into the water, and a lot of people suffered from, because it's so deep, they
Mhm.
suffered from nitrogen poisoning, or the bends.
Wow.
And so he also fell ill, and his wife took over the
Uh,
project.
wow.
And what is fascinating about this is she has a plaque on the bridge now, and there's been some like recent, hey, we're going to celebrate Mrs. Roebling as the person who was the chief engineer on this project and saw it through. But at the time, they didn't advertise, and she didn't insist on it, the fact that she was the chief engineer, because people wouldn't go over a bridge that a woman had built.
Oh.
So I bring all this up just to talk about the history that we get in school.
Mhm.
It's just the tip of the iceberg, and that there is so much more to be explored in the stories that are not frequently told, because
Yes.
the stories that are frequently told are told by men, and
Mhm.
they are at the forefront of those stories, uh,
Yes.
which makes sense, right? I want to write a story about me and my cohorts and whatnot.
Well, and
There's
they
so much.
typically comprise the juries or the award,
Mhm.
the groups that decide who gets what awards, and yeah, so that's the press.
Exactly. Press was largely controlled by men, back then, and so like I'm I'm on this kind of journey to find more of the history that has not been, that I haven't experienced,
Mhm.
that is being told, but that you have to seek out more.
Yeah.
And I'm finding it to be, on the one hand, really amazing because I'm learning so much about what is going on, and some really great spots around like Mrs. Roebling and the bridge and how she took it over, and there were slews of men under her foremanship, under that were completely okay with this, even if society wasn't. Um, and that, but I'm also saddened by some of the things because I don't really realize that we weren't given the right to vote at
Mhm.
the same time as other people were, and
Mhm.
that we had to fight for another 20 years.
Mhm.
And in New York, you weren't allowed to sit on a jury as a woman until 1927.
That's the thing. And you said it earlier, but that's the thing that always gets me is we use the word history or her story, and it really does sound like, oh, so long ago. And yet, this was only 200 years ago. This was
Mhm.
only a few decades ago when women got the right to do many things, include have a bank account. And I think we should all sit with that for a while.
Yeah, yeah.
This isn't that many generations ago.
Well, and the saying of those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it
Yeah.
really feels palpable right now, because I mean, we talked to a great woman last week who is putting herself out there, running for office, being a part of the conversation, being a part of change in Grand Rapids, and just how important that is, because we are at a time in our lives where rights are being systematically taken away from swaths of the population.
Yes,
And so we got to be in it. We
we
got to
got to
get
be
it.
in it. We got to talk about it. Agree. And so your story about the Gilded Ages and the divorce and the double standard.
Mhm.
Wow. The story about the bridge makes me just reflect on the men that worked for her respected her. They did a fantastic job.
Mhm.
So the people that know the women in
Yeah.
charge or as part of the team don't usually have the issue. But there's that cultural
Yeah.
just reverberation of to know that a woman was the lead in building the Brooklyn Bridge might have had people not drive across it or trust it. It's just like, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and how much of your accomplishment did you have to give up because of fear?
Hmm.
And how much do people not, you just, there's so much fear that's out there with like, oh, I can't trust this thing. And so even though I did it, I have to let everyone think that my husband is still very much in this.
Mm-hmm.
He he didn't actually visit I might get this wrong, but I don't think he actually visited the bridge after it was opened because he was just so infirm.
Hmm.
And it's, I mean, crazy,
Mm-hmm.
crazy.
Mm-hmm.
To think that like this wonderful, amazing person had to wait 120 years for her plaque to be put on the Brooklyn Bridge for us to start
For
talking.
many reasons.
Mhm.
Which is almost like a metaphor in, corporate life. It's fine to have women on staff,
Right.
but the man needs to be the leader and the man needs to be the presenter and the man needs to, otherwise there might not be trust.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to get to the point where we are 50-50.
Yeah.
Um, when countries, I think Finland has a rule around boards have to be 50-50.
Oh,
And
okay.
they are run like there's far fewer catastrophic things like is happening with Boeing right now, where the company is in crisis.
Mhm.
There's far fewer things that happen in those companies that are split like that because you have a balanced point of view.
Mhm.
You have different perspectives that are coming in, and not to say that it should be all women. That's not what
Right.
we're asking for. We're
No.
asking for equality. We're asking for representation.
Mhm.
Because those ideas generate goodness,
Mhm.
goodness in direction, goodness in culture, goodness in business profits, first and foremost.
Yeah.
Um, and you don't get into these crises.
Yeah. And women do most of the consuming and buying and decision making about acquisitions.
Yeah.
I saw another post a little bit like what you're describing yesterday, which just, let's talk about all of the things that were invented by women that we don't think of. And there's so much. There's the first computer programmer was a woman. The first, the lead into COBOL was led by a woman. The just so many things, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and this and that, and um, the ability to translate between technology or really complex ideas and simple day-to-day tasks. You know, generally the women can just be that kind of interpreter or aggregator of good information and making that a reality. So how do we lift up the women to get to that 50-50 and still lift up the men as well? I mean, the world is still generally 50-50
Yeah.
in terms of gender.
I feel like there has to be a shift in the culture because often what is cited is, well, there's not enough women in STEM to make it 50-50. So that's why we get away with having it be just 10% or 20% female engineers. And a lot of women shy away from those careers because they are so male dominated and they're seen as very cutthroat. And you have to be more masculine in order to make it in
Mhm.
those areas. And we can wait for super brave women across the world to opt into that and to, but I think what we're doing is we're distilling some of what makes the 50-50 split so good by making them be in this pool of very masculine energy. And that if we were to make it okay to be a little bit more in the collaborative space, a little bit more in the thoughtful space, a little bit more in maybe the introverted space, where we take the time and we get everybody's ideas out on the table instead of just whoever's talking the most. Um, then we can make those environments places where women want to be.
Mhm.
I mean, it shouldn't have to be courage and bravery that make it so that you succeed in those areas.
It shouldn't. I mean, that's exhausting.
Mhm.
And so, how do we do that? Because the opportunity to have a more thoughtful environment is viewed as soft.
Mhm.
Or even worse, woo woo.
I don't know how we do it, but I think that the men are imperative to it.
Mhm.
And really understanding where that question of where is the animosity coming from? And what if we were in a world where everybody's viewpoints got heard?
Mhm.
What if we and to kind of lean into exploring both sides of the energies.
Mhm.
We've talked about in past episodes how um, your masculine energy was welcome at home, but not necessarily at work.
Yeah.
And I worked in tech where masculine energy was very welcome.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't develop and refine the feminine energy until later,
Mhm.
until I felt like it was missing. But what if we as people explored both energies and both were considered um, good,
Mhm.
right? The when we think about men, I get a lot of posts on social media around um, center masculinity, and some people talk about that as demasculinity or unmasculinity, and I'm like, well, you can't demasculate someone. It's just not, that's not a thing. But that idea of what if we explored all of our energies and that was okay,
Yeah.
and we see someone doing something that is invoking their own feminine energy or their own masculine energy,
Mhm.
we celebrate and admire that versus get scared about that.
Yeah. I like that. And as you're saying it, I'm thinking it's okay to give ourselves permission to be a little bit fluid in that and make decisions based on the moment or
Mhm.
based on the day. Do we need a little bit more male energy right now for this particular thing, or do we need a little bit more female energy to be more connected and more community oriented, more thoughtful and open? And the same for men. A lot of men get struggle with this cultural identity of male energy and would love to admit that they have their moments where they would love to be softer and more caring and compassionate, but they can't, or they're afraid of that.
Right. Of the implications.
Yeah,
What I
yeah,
mean if I'm not a manly man,
right.
I'm going to
Exactly.
be torn down. Well, no, let's build people up with all the energies that they have.
Hmm. So all of that has to do with fear of being excommunicated from the community and never allowed back, like the divorcee. Uh, it just keeps living on and on and on, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Yeah. We're so fearful of being outcast
Mm-hmm.
that we have to stay in our boxes. And
Mm-hmm.
then as society, right, there is structure that's been around for a very long time to keep people controlled.
Mm-hmm. Organized.
Yes, organized, and controlled into this is what's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we don't, mass chaos is gonna.
Woo, mass chaos. If yeah, yeah, yeah. But right now, and organized, especially in the US, organized capitalistic culture, move forward, progress, make money,
Yeah,
jobs, 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 economy.
the impact.
I still get to, but it's women that are doing most of the buying. But
Yeah,
here we are.
here we are.
So I like your idea. Let's start with ourselves. That's always where it should start. If we can't do these things ourselves, it's hard to describe or tell others to do these things, but balancing female male and acknowledging we do both have all have both. It's not that you're born as a woman and you have all female energy or vice versa, and many are struggling with gender identity, and that's okay. Um, I think we learned in one of our former classes that the Native Americans thought that those that exhibited both strong female and male energy were almost godlike and revered
Yep,
because they were the essence of balance.
yep.
I thought
They were able to tap into both.
they were able to tap into both. And look
Yeah,
at how connected they were to nature, the natural cycles of a year. We all talk about mindfulness, mindset, well-being.
yeah.
The indigenous peoples might have known a heck of a lot more about that than we ever will.
It wasn't about cultivating it after the fact. It was about being it as they grew.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, thank you.
Thank
Great,
you.
great research.
There on the docket, there is a book about gender identity by Judith Butler, I believe their name is. Um, and pretty controversial kind of academic, but I'm interested to see what their latest book is called Who's Mad About Gender?
Okay.
Um, just because the idea of gender fluidness or the idea of non-binary scares people,
Oh
makes
yeah.
them, and doesn't scare me.
Yeah.
Doesn't
Whatever.
scare, yeah, yeah.
Just
Let's,
show up as a nice, decent human being and I'm good.
yeah. So I'm interested to hear about their research and figure out what they're saying about, what is happening. Because I'm in the, and as again, I live on the West Coast where it's pretty like you be you. Totally get it why some people want to wear skirts and why some people don't want to wear skirts. And you can choose, and it's just clothing at the end of the day. Like it doesn't need to say anything.
But it's back
What
to that culture and that back to that you're going outside of the norm. And live in the Midwest, in a very conservative area of the Midwest, and those issues come up all the time, even in healthcare. What rights should people have?
yes.
What rights shouldn't people have? And that's really tough,
Yeah.
very tough.
Well, especially since healthcare is a fundamental aspect of all society and how we grow old. And if you're not given healthcare, if you're not able to check the box that is relevant to you, you know what? Funny thing, on those same healthcare forms where there's typically only two choices, there's also questions around your divorce status.
Hmm.
Are you separated? Are you divorced? Are you married? Or are you single? And when my husband and I were both getting divorces a few years from other people, um, and it really pissed him off. He's like, "Why does it matter?
Right.
Why do why do I have to click that I'm divorced?
Yeah.
Why do we put more stock in being married than we do on like?" And again, it could come back to, well, it matters if you have a community around you. But whether you are married or not does not indicate whether or not you have a healthy marriage or a healthy community around you.
No, it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with payer source.
Mm. Mm.
And the things that really do matter, like culturally, um, socioeconomic status, those things have not been asked in the past and are just beginning to, because those things really do impact health.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
I
that's all
mean,
new. And more than two options on gender. That's all new.
yeah.
Hmm. Very controversial. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Lots more to come.
Absolutely. Talk
Have a
soon.
good one.